This is Title 18, Word Crimes. I'm Erik Arneson. This episode was recorded live at a Noir at the Bar event in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the aptly named Misconduct Tavern. Altogether, 12 authors read their work. Here on the Word Crimes podcast, I'm dividing it into 3 parts. This is part 3, with readings by Jonathan Woods, me, Duane Swierczynski, and Jon McGoran. If you missed either of the first 2 parts, they are available on my website, on iTunes, on Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Our MC, Peter Rozovsky, the man behind the international crime fiction blog Detectives Beyond Borders, handles the introductions perfectly, so let's get to the stories. This is Noir at the Bar, Philadelphia.
Jonathan Woods had a bit of trouble getting here. He's the author of Bad Juju and Other Tales of Madness and Mayhem, the novel A Death in Mexico, and the collection Phone Call from Hell and Other Tales of the Damned. His story Swinger is Anonymous, and it's quite a story, has now been made into a short, it's autobiographical, a short noir film, and he lives in Key West. Jonathan Woods.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to just read a short excerpt from a story called A Lucky Man, which is in my 3rd book, Phone Call from Hell, which book also contains the notorious story Swingers Anonymous. And just I might add that I brought a few copies if anyone would be interested. In this excerpt, a corporate raider by the name of Brian Midnight goes down to Key West with his son Chad, who was just thrown out of Pepperdine University for having a meth lab in his dorm room, to do some sports fishing and generally to get into some deep shit. So here goes. It was a little after 10 Saturday morning when Captain Bob finally cranked up the Evinrude and headed his flatboat out of the slip on Stock Island and turned up the Keys toward Bonefish country. In a hungover haze, Chad slumped amidships, sipping on his second colada of the morning. That's Cuban for 4 shots of espresso, strong enough to wake a zombie. As Captain Bob's calloused and age-spotted hands bore down on the throttle, I sat in the skiff's bow, feeling the nautical breeze ruffle my carefully tended locks, daydreaming about the flame-eyed Bubba chick who'd been scanning me from the bar stool at the Parrot the night before. Bonding with my offspring had held me back from testing the depths of her interest, but she was a great mental fuck. Captain Bob himself was fairly the worse for wear. Hunkered down by the aft guide platform, his hulking, hairy form draped in weathered khakis reminded me of an obese orangutan dressed up for a tea party. His bloated, sagging visage could easily have been from a corpse 3 days in the water. One wandering eye squinted into the sun. The other, so red and swollen shut by some recent brawl, it looked like the last weazened apple at the bottom of the barrel after a long, hard winter. An ancient ship's officer cap was drawn rakishly over his drab, gray-streaked curls that looked like they'd been trimmed by a psychopath, armed with a dull straight razor. So much for being bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as we set forth to partake of the greatest sport fishing in the world, fly fishing for the elusive and paranoid bonefish. Somewhere near Lower Sugarloaf Key, Captain Bob veered through a narrow mangrove-edged channel that brought us out on the Gulf side. Ahead, the palest turquoise water shimmered and slid in a broad, cascading array over white sand flats. Captain Bob killed the Evinrude and tilted it out of the water before it hit bottom. With a groan, he mounted the guide platform and began to pole us over the knee-deep waters of the flats, his one good eye panning across 180 degrees for the telltale flicker of a bonefish tail fin. Rod in hand, line baited with a bonefish slider, I waited on Captain Bob's whispered alert that a wily bonefish was in the offing. 3 hours later, with nary a sighting, my enthusiasm was beginning to materially sag. The imperious tropical sun beat down relentlessly like a cat o' nine tails of the Marquis de Sade. Chad, having early on lost interest in the possibilities of bone fishing, had taken off his shirt, chugged 2 beers from the cooler, and fallen asleep in the blazing sun in his minimal swim trunks. His only signs of life were the occasional flop from back to stomach or the reverse to ensure that he was evenly burned on every surface. Captain Bob just kept poling and scanning, his leathery reptilian skin deflecting all ill effects of the sun's rays. Not a discouraging word, or any other, escaped his sun-baked lips. I began to wonder whether he had drifted into some catatonic limbo state halfway between being and nothingness. The monotony of the business was starting to weigh on my soul. I could feel rage rising in my gut at the chimerical bonefish I knew were taunting us from the shimmering horizon. They were out there, laughing at us, if fish could laugh. If a school of the gray ghosts of the flats, as Zane Grey once described them, had flitted by at that moment, I would have happily dropped a grenade in their midst. Relax, I cautioned myself. You're on vacation. You love sport fishing. Reaching into my breast pocket of my shirt, I extracted a medium-sized spliff and fired it up. It seemed like seconds later, or was it hours, that I heard a gravelly whisper, 11 o'clock, about 70 feet out, near the patch of floating seaweed. Was I hallucinating? No, it was Captain Bob. We had a live one. Cautiously, I rose to a standing position. Didn't want to scare the little bastard with any sudden movements. Then I saw him, the quicksilver flash of a tail fin partially out of water, just to the left of a clump of gulfweed. I drew my rod back over my shoulder, my wrist whipping backwards to make the cast, sending the weighted line first circling behind, then hurling forward toward the flickering shadow of the target. Next moment, a deep, gurgling howl of pain and rage rose up behind me. My head snapped around, my eyes blinking in disbelief. The barbed hook of my fly had snagged Captain Bob's good eye, and the force of my forward cast had yanked the eye from the socket. Yeah! Captain Bob's arms flew up in a flurry of flailing activity, vainly seeking to retrieve the missing eyeball. Blind, or nearly so, he tottered left, then right, his mouth agape and slobbering like some primordial fish out of water. One deck shoe-shod foot slipped off the edge of the guide platform, and Captain Bob pitched sideways in slow motion, landing in an explosion of seawater. Chad lurched to his feet. What the fuck? His eye! It's his eye! I screamed, jumping up and down and madly reeling in the line from my fatal cast. What the fuck are you talking about, Dad? Whose eye? Captain Bob's, I said. I had fully rewound my line. The bonefish slider was still attached to the end, but the eye was gone. It was out there somewhere, maybe floating like a cork. Did eyeballs float? Or rolling lazily across the sandy bottom? Or had the bonefish gobbled it up in some macabre feeding frenzy? Then I looked at Captain Bob, his khaki-covered bulk slumped face down in the shallow water like a bag of trash tossed from a passing luxury yacht. Captain Bob was a goner.
Thanks. Erik Arneson's stories have appeared in Needle, grift, quick crimes, off the record too, out of the gutter online and beat to a pulp. He's an editor at Shotgun Honey. He hosts the World Crimes podcast, and he wrote the comic book Fortune. He also posts things at erikarneson.com, and that's Eric with a K.
Thank you. This is not like everything I'm going to read, meaning I'm not going to read all of that. Right, exactly. I phrased that poorly. First, I want to say my friend Dylan Samuelson is here tonight. He's the guy that did the artwork for the poster, so fantastic artwork. And I don't know if you guys are going to like what I read or not, but I do. That's probably true. I do think that you're an audience whose affections can be bought easily. So I have these. They're free. This is more art by Dylan Samuelson, by the way. It's a short story I wrote. It's set in Philly in 1951. It's about the mayor's race. I'm not reading from that, which might have been smart to read from. But I have lots of those, so if you're interested in one, come see me afterwards. Muldoon lifted his head and stared at the drink. He was thirsty, but too sad and too lonely to stick his tongue into the refreshing elixir. The memory that haunted him, being lifted away from his parents and kidnapped 3 weeks ago, was as clear as the water in his bowl. "What's wrong, little kitten?" said the voice. He hated being called little kitten. His name was Muldoon, for crying out loud. A good name, a strong name. He felt his anger rising. But when the hand connected to the voice stroked the striped orange fur on his back, he couldn't sustain his anger no matter how much he tried. The hand was soft, gentle. It knew what it was doing. Against his will, Muldoon heard himself begin to purr. "See? It's not that bad, little kitten." As the hand continued its expert caresses, Muldoon knew that the voice connected to the hand was right. It wasn't that bad. It was worse. All he wanted was to be back in the cardboard box, kneading his mother's stomach and drinking milk. But Muldoon felt himself plop onto the floor and roll onto his back. His paws swayed in the air while the hand continued to rub him. He couldn't help it as his purrs grew louder. Humiliating. All right, now we skip ahead a little bit, a la Sam Starnes. Muldoon has escaped the kidnappers. He is now out on the city streets searching for his parents. This is a serious story. Muldoon stood at the street corner looking back and forth. He had no idea which way to go. He saw more people to the left than the right, and in his experience, cats lived with people, so he went left. Slinking down the sidewalk with his body pressed against the brick buildings, Muldoon took in the sights. People walking, people running, one person riding on a motorized chair. Cars zoomed past on the street. Buildings stretched to the sky with most windows dark, but some illuminated, and bright signals hung over the street, changing from green to yellow to red, and back to green. Crossing a small street, he heard a sound from the dark. Psst. He stopped and cocked his head to the side to listen better. Again. Psst. "Who is that?" Muldoon asked. "Where are you?" Psst. Muldoon moved toward the sound, caution overtaken by curiosity. Entering the alley's shadows, he carefully avoided the broken glass scattered across the pavement. He saw a small beast emerge from behind a pile of garbage bags. The four-legged creature was covered in dark gray hair, had a long hairless tail, and spoke with a deliberate cadence. "Hello, little kitten," it said. Muldoon bristled at being called little kitten. "My name is Muldoon," he said, trying to sound tough. Your name is Dinner, the beast whispered, with just a hint of a grin. Muldoon's hair stood on end. Dinner? That's ridiculous, he said, hoping he sounded braver than he felt. Dinner's a meal, not a name. What kind of beast are you anyway? It grinned wider, showing its teeth. A rat, it said. A hungry rat. Muldoon's stomach twisted. What do rats like to eat? The rat's grin transformed into a snarl. A thick string of saliva dropped from his mouth to the cracked pavement, and his voice grew louder. What do rats eat? Let's show the little kitten what rats eat, boys.
Thanks. Duane Swierczynski is up next. He is the Edgar-nominated and Anthony and Seamus winning author of Fun and Games, as well as the forthcoming Canary. He's also a prolific writer of comics, Judge Dredd, X-Con, and the forthcoming Black Hood. He is also the first ever author at Noir at the Bar. So please welcome Noir at the Bar's very own George Washington, Duane Swierczynski.
Another founding mother.
Founding mother. Thank you, Old Man River. Appreciate that. Ed's what? Were you 57 today or 58?
Almost soon.
Okay, good.
Halloween.
I'm not trying to follow a cat being eaten alive by rats, but thank you, Eric, wherever you are. He might. But actually, oddly enough, this is a piece from my book called Canary. It's out next February. It was cut by my editor, and I agree with the cut. Actually, it didn't fit tone-wise, but I still like this piece, so fuck him. I'm going to read it anyway. Middle age. Fuck you, middle age. Yeah, seriously. All right. It's a serious piece, so brace yourselves. Every 10 years or so, the Philadelphia underworld completely loses its fucking mind. The oceans of blood flow in predictable patterns. There will be time of calm, of docile dons, of veal piccata, of gifted Cadillacs, of quiet government wiretaps, their magnetic tapes spinning in silent perpetual motion. And then there will come a time, predictably, inevitably, when the young soldiers rebel against their older establishment. Now, the establishment should know better, because half a generation ago, they were the rebels pissing their elders' parmesan. Yet they always choose to ignore the threat, thinking the younger generation wouldn't dare. But oh yes, they would. So then comes a time of war, of baseball bats to skulls, of shotgun blasts to surprise faces, of drill bits spitting into flesh, muscle, bone, and marrow, of body dumps and pipe bombs and drive-bys, and homebrewed arsenic dripping from the pasty of a bottle-blonde stripper. This is not one of those times. The mob was supposed to be dead. For the past decade, reporters and local news anchors have been ringing the death knell of the Philly branch of La Cosa Nostra. But this year, no really, this was the end of the mob, for real, last chapter in the book. Even the local reporter who had been covering the mob since the late 70s was packing it in, telling people he was headed down to the shore to write books about dogs and shit. Makes him real money for a change. That reporter's final mob story was a sad little fart of a coda. About a month ago, you had the trial of the reputed Last Don, which was seriously weak sauce. The state's witnesses were both desperate and sort of morons. Stakes were low, too. Most of the charges involved gambling rackets, and who gave a shit about gambling rackets? The nicknames were even more lackluster. Fuck-face Donnie and extra-ass Eddie. Stuff like that. Nobody seemed to notice when the trial ended, not least of all the reporter. Conventional wisdom had it the mob was dead. Dead. Place the red and white checkered tablecloth over the last body and turn the lights off when you leave. But wait. Who's this riding around a bus in South Philly late at night? Ringo can't believe it. He's actually happy to be riding a fucking SEPTA bus. SEPTA is short for Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. Who'd have thought he missed that mouthful? But after a decade and change out in buttfuck Kansas, hawking used cars to Ma and Pa's six-pack, who'd always comment on how much he looked and sounded like one of those wise guys they see on the TV. Never just TV, always the TV. Ringo's glad to be back in a city that does not give a fuck, where people mind their own business. His return is a little precarious, as they say. He can't risk being pulled over, so no driving. The bus would have to do. It's an interesting way to see a city, he'll say that much. 20 years ago, Richie Ringo Gloriosa had been a loyal soldier in the side of the D'Argenio family during the brutal D'Argenio-Pirelli War of the early 90s. And soldier wasn't a euphemism. Ringo was the real deal. A few years before the war, he got into serious trouble with some Russian gangsters, uncut heroin, a narcoleptic call girl, and a shotgun. The D'Argenios thought it was best for Ringo to leave town for a while and go off to finishing school in the U.S. military. At least until the heat died down a little bit, which does and always does in Philadelphia. Ringo returned with an entirely new skill set and a certain amount of fearlessness, which served him well on the home front. After the D'Argenio-Pirelli War, the former family ended up indicted, dead, or witness protection. The latter family, the Pirellis, took the throne 10 years later, when the same thing more or less happened to them at some point. That was the way it went down in Philly. Now, against all fucking good sense and reason, Ringo was back, and working with Pirelli. Go figure. They offered him a ride to the meet, but Ringo insisted on the public transportation. Fuck, now he was saying it too. They were meeting at this Asian bar restaurant thing on Washington Avenue, inside a private karaoke room. Just as long as no one fucking sang. Ringo couldn't handle that after all this nonsense. Working with two ex-cops, that was the other surprise. He didn't know either of them back in the day. Hell, they were just pups back in the day. The one they called Frankenstein was probably a toddler back in '94, when Ringo was in his prime. The one they called Bird was a young blood too. What did the Philadelphia Police Department do to these guys to have them so demoralized at such a young age? He can only guess. But the biggest shockaroo was the man who put this whole thing together. The same man who tracked him down in witness protection, one of the few guys alive who could do such a thing. Ringo's first thought was, get the fuck out of here. Him? Then again, that's why Ringo loves this town. Philadelphia, where you can always count on someone to do the absolutely wrong thing.
Jon McGoran is the author of the ecological thrillers Drift and Dead Out, and the novella After Effects, writing under the name D.H. Dublin. He wrote the forensic thrillers Body Trace, Blood Poison, and Freezer Burn. He also set this event up, so he deserves some extra applause. And he was, I think, the second Noir at the Bar reader in 2008, so please welcome Noir at the Bar's very own Thomas Jefferson, Jon McGoran.
Thank you. I'm going to read a little bit of a story that was it was a distinguished story in the Best American Mystery Stories. So Dennis Tafoya's story was actually in it. Unfortunately, they don't have an anthology called The Second Best American Mystery Stories. Otherwise, I definitely would have been in that. But I'm happy to read part of it here. Jerry Costa was sitting in the back of Gary's bar. I sat down next to him. Hey, Jerry, I said, you got that $200 you owe me? It wasn't the first time I'd asked, and I didn't expect it to be the last. I brought it up whenever I saw him, just so it didn't turn into one of those things where he never paid me back, but somehow he used to owe me money, like it was a thing of the past. But each time he blew me off. We got closer to crossing that line, where he was a confirmed deadbeat, and I was out $200. He seemed comfortable with that. So I was surprised when he brightened up like he just remembered where he left it. Yeah, Bliss, he said, sounding almost surprised himself. I got your money. I half expected him to pull it out of a hidden money belt or a secret pocket. Instead, he said, I just need you to give me a ride to go get it. I was pretty sure he was full of shit, but I also knew that if I didn't play along, he'd always be able to say he tried to pay me back that one time, but I wouldn't give him a ride. That's how I ended up standing on a porch in the middle of Logan, a fucked-up neighborhood of run-down houses separated by hard-packed dirt or weeds tall enough to hide a patrolling pit bull. Jerry talked shit the whole ride over, buzzing like a gnat in my ear, giving me directions and telling me the story about how this guy owed him money. Even as we walked up the sagging wooden steps to the porch, I kept waiting for him to admit he was bullshitting me and go back to being the deadbeat we both knew he was. Instead, when I stopped at the edge of the doormat, Jerry took 2 more steps and rang the doorbell. The inside door was open, but the storm door was closed, dented white aluminum with a cloudy plexiglass window. The house was dark inside, and if the inner door hadn't been open, I would have thought no one was home. The plastic doormat had a half-plucked daisy and the word welcome written in patchy fake grass, like it didn't really mean it. Jerry rang the bell again almost immediately and stepped back so he was behind me and off to the side. I gave him a look. "The guy owes me money," he said. "Might not answer if he sees it's me." I was starting to say, "Get over here," because I wasn't there to collect his debts for him. But I stopped when I heard a faint metallic click. I didn't recognize the sound right away, but Jerry did, or maybe he was expecting it. He grabbed the railing on the side of the porch, swung his legs over, and disappeared. By then I had recognized it too. I dropped down low as the first bullet punched through the plexiglass, and I wondered in the back of my mind what kind of asshole shoots through his own front door. 2 more bullets tore through the aluminum, leaving holes surrounded by little silver rings. The planks on either side of my feet popped like popcorn, one side, then the other, sending up 2 little clouds of splintered dry rot. The door kicked open, and the guy that came through it was 6'4", maybe 300 pounds. He had on a big denim jacket, buttoned up tight, and jeans that billowed out around his legs. His massive head was round and bald, and he had a big bushy beard, like his afro had slid off his head and settled onto his chin. He came at me with his gun extended, snarling in anger, but with something else, too, like he was scared maybe or crazy. He was coming too fast for me to run away, so I closed on him instead, getting behind the gun before he could react. I grabbed him by his jacket and pulled, letting myself fall down and back, using his momentum against him. He kept coming forward, his face surprised to be so close to mine. I braced a foot against his belly and rolled onto my back, pulling him up, but not quite over. Time slows down in situations like that, but he seemed to stall right above me, looking down at me, still surprised. I could feel his weight on my leg, and I wondered if he was going to come down on top of me, if that alone would kill me. My muscles screamed, and my back compressed under the weight as the surprise in his eyes turned back into anger. His hands were braced against the floor, but then he seemed to remember he had a gun in one of them, and he shifted his weight so he could point it at me. That was enough incentive for me. With a grunt, I heaved him the rest of the way. His eyes rolled up, looking ahead to see where he was going. I looked up, too, and saw the top step and then open space. As he flew head first off the porch, I expected him to put his hands out to break his fall, but instead he two-handed the gun and pointed it at me. As he disappeared, I heard the gunshot and felt the bullet slam into the steps. Then I heard a thud. The muscles in my back and my thighs screamed as I got to my hands and knees and peeked over the edge of the porch. Whoever he was down, and he wasn't getting back up. He landed on the sidewalk. His big head was no longer round. The top was flat and the sides were creased and bleeding. His eyes were open, big, dark, and uneven, slightly crossed as they stared into the sky. His fingers were twitching. There was a kid on a scooter looking down at him, about 9 years old. He turned to look up at me. "Who is that guy?" I asked, nodding toward the body on the sidewalk. The kid looked down, tilting his head and squinting, like maybe it was hard to tell with the head all flattened. Then he looked up at me with the same expression, like maybe he was trying to figure out why I'd done that to the guy if I didn't even know who he was. Our eyes met, and he shook his head. Then we both looked back at the guy on the ground. His fingers stopped twitching, and blood started trickling out of his ear. "Fuck," I said. The kid nodded in agreement, then scooted around the body and continued down the block. Now you can close it up. Bring it on home, Peter.
We're done. And we'll see you all tomorrow and for the rest of the weekend. Welcome to Noir at the Bar. Welcome to NoirCon. Welcome to Philadelphia.
Thank you, Peter.
That was Noir at the Bar, Philadelphia, recorded live on October 29th, 2014. Thanks again to Jon McGoran for organizing the event and for inviting me to participate. That was the first time I ever read my work in public. It probably shows, but I will never forget it. Thanks, Jon. You can find links to all of the authors featured on this episode and more in the show notes on my website, erikarneson.com. That's ERIKARNESON.com. Every episode of the Title 18 Word Crimes podcast is archived right there at erikarneson.com. I'm also at Erik Arneson on Twitter, and I'm easy to find on Facebook. That's all for this episode of Title 18 Word Crimes. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. On our next episode, the voice of Word Crimes, Scott Detro, will read a short story by Johnny Shaw, the author of Big Maria. The music on this episode is by The Throws. You can find them at The Throws, THROES, thethrows.com. Thanks again for listening to Title 18 Word Crimes. We'll be back soon.
I'm not sure I follow a cat being eaten alive by rats, but thank you, Eric, wherever you are.